Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey. In today's video, I'll be taking an early look at my transfer plans ahead of Game Week 21. Right then, so before we get stuck into my transfer plans ahead of Game Week 21, a quick recap of how Game Week 20 has gone so far. Of course, we've still got the Forest Wolves game to be played on Monday night. At time of recording, it's after the Man United Liverpool 2-2 draw. So we've got the bonus points in for that. 70 points all out for me this week is a good week. Not spectacular, but it should be enough for a green arrow. Of course, if Chris Wood does something big tomorrow, then that will put a bit of a dent in it. But overall, pretty happy. I didn't make any moves, so I've now got 3 free transfers going into Game Week 21 and a little bit of money in the bank, which I'll explain later. Looking around my side, of course, there were a couple of highlights, that being in particular Brian Mbeumo, 19 points against Southampton away from home, 2 goals and an assist. Of course, the maximum bonus points there as well. And with Man City coming up at home next, I'll explain why I think that's actually quite a good fixture in just a moment's time. Cole Palmer and Mo Salah did almost nothing to benefit my rank despite being in my team because of their effective ownership, and quite similar can be said for Alexander Isak as well, although it is better to own them and get the points rather than not own them and go up against them knowing that they are almost inevitably going to be scoring goals. The other player that did make a positive impact for me was João Pedro. It did come as a bit of a bittersweet moment when he got the penalty awarded, because of course it meant that the double Arsenal clean sheet was probably going to get wiped out by João Pedro himself. But of course it's good to own the penalty taker, and I wasn't going to sell him just because I didn't want him playing against Arsenal and their double defence. So that's actually worked out pretty well, or about as good as it could have, considering the clean sheet was wiped out. Overall though, pretty happy. It should be enough for a green arrow. We'll see tomorrow night, but I've got 3 free transfers and a lot of different avenues I can pursue. Let me know as always in the comments below how you did, so far at least, in Game Week 20. And let me know as well how many points you managed to have on your bench this week. I've of course got another week where I've benched a pretty decent haul in Amad Diallo this week. So let me know in the comments below whether you had any points sat on your bench as well. Right then, so 3 free transfers and 0.4 in the bank gives me a bit of room for manoeuvre going into Game Week 21. But there are issues in my side that ideally I would like to sort out over the next couple of game weeks. Now, one thing that I always want to note at this stage in the season is I try to implement a high bar on transfers being made. So transfers, especially this season where you can roll them up to 5 times, means that they are all very precious. And going into the double game weeks, if you can have yourself a cluster of 3 or 4 free transfers going into a period of time where you might want to use a chip, or you've got a double game week that you really want to be aggressive on and try and load up on double game week players, then having those free transfers in the bank is going to be way more powerful than using it in just a regular single game week, unless you see real upside on the move. So I am playing a fairly conservative game at the moment. That's why I've got 3 free transfers in the first place. Otherwise, I probably would have made a couple of extra moves last week going into Game Week 20. As it stands though, because I've implemented that high bar, it meant that I held on to the likes of Brian Mbeumo before he scored the week before against Arsenal, and now obviously had the treat of Southampton 19-pointer. The same goes for João Pedro, who almost certainly would have left my team last week if it wasn't for, or ahead of last week, if it wasn't for that high bar for free transfers. I'm trying to basically resist anything I'm 50-50 on at the moment. That doesn't mean I can't make moves, of course, and because I've got a few in the bank already, maybe I can be a bit more aggressive. There are also players that I'm quite simply not happy with in my side. As you can see here, there are definitely issues that I would like to resolve. And the first one I want to focus on, perhaps because it leads into other plans that I might want to make with my transfers, is Nicholas Jackson, who now only has 1 goal in his last 7 matches, had another very iffy performance, although he does lead the line well for Chelsea, in the sense that he presses very well, he's good positionally. Because he's not scoring goals at the moment, it always does mean that there's a chance he gets taken off early, or you never know, he could, of course, also get benched at times as well, which we have seen in the last 7 or 8 game weeks. He's also quite a lot of money, so I've got 8 million invested in him at the moment, and there are strikers at cheaper price points who have penalties, unlike Jackson, who doesn't, who get better minutes or similar minutes for lower price. And with arguably now, whilst Chelsea's fixtures coming aren't terrible, I'll just bring them up on screen now, they're not bad fixtures coming, but they're also not necessarily blockbuster. So Bournemouth at home, who have been very good against stronger opposition this year. Wolves, who are under new management. Okay, it's a good fixture, but that could go either way in terms of what Wolves are going to turn up. Man City away, you can see Jackson maybe getting something on the break there, but it'll be a tightly contested game. Then, of course, West Ham, Brighton, Aston Villa. It's definitely not a bad run, and you probably could hold on to Jackson, and as could I at the moment if I want to implement that high bar. As we've seen, you've got decent minutes across the last few, but you get the odd benching. That Ipswich 135 minutes was painful to take. Southampton as well, he didn't even come off the bench in that game. Outside of that, you're looking at around 70 to 80 minutes a match. So is that enough for someone who's worth 8 million? Quite possibly, considering our budget is spread at the moment, but that 1 goal in 7 when other strikers who are cheaper are outperforming him is quite hard to take. So if I was to replace him, there's a few options I could be looking at right now. Now, number one will be maybe of no surprise, but Raul Jimenez, after 2 goals today, is going to be top of the billing for a lot of managers. I can see a bit of a surge in transfers in for him over the next few days. The next couple of fixtures, of course, are fantastic. West Ham and Leicester, both away from home, but good fixtures nonetheless. Then Man United, Newcastle after that. It's not a bad little run, although what I would say is after the next 2, it doesn't look anywhere near as positive. So Man United, Newcastle, Forest, who have been fantastic defensively, Palace, Wolves, Brighton, Spurs, all the way through to game week 31 as well. It's not an ideal run after the next 2. But, of course, if you want him short term, he's a fantastic pickup. What I'm trying not to do with Jimenez is get carried away by the fact he scored 2 goals against Ipswich, because both of them were penalties. It does confirm that he's on penalties, which is great, but you wouldn't expect him to bag a couple of penalties every single game. In fact, looking at the season so far, he was on 6 goals until today. So it's maybe a little bit of a balancing of the books where he gets a couple of penalties and it all balances out a little bit, but I wouldn't expect that every single week. The next 2 fixtures are, of course, good, so I wouldn't rule it out, but Jimenez might just be a little bit of a bandwagon and maybe overperforming on the data because of the penalties this week. The one player that I'm really tempted by would be Jean-Philippe Mateta. Now, those fixtures for Palace last a lot longer than Fulham's. He is a bit more expensive, another 1.6 million in terms of the budget, but the next few are very, very decent. So Leicester, West Ham as well, so it's the reverse almost, followed by Brentford, Man United, Everton, Fulham. That's a much better stretch of fixtures all the way through. And if I'm looking at wildcarding around about game week 30, which is currently the abstract plan that I might be implementing, more on that to come over the next few weeks, of course. But if I'm looking at that kind of window, then I probably won't need to transfer him out until I wildcard. And because I'm implementing that high bar for transfers, it might be quite nice to, if I'm using a transfer now on a forward, to know that I'm safe holding on to him all the way through to when I wildcard. So I won't want to use another transfer on this position. Now, the problem is, of course, that up until recently, in fact, game week 20, Mateta was on a barren spell himself. So he hadn't scored in the last, 5 Premier League games, but since Ipswich in game week 14. Obviously scored against Chelsea, but he is on penalties from what we've seen so far this season. And he's got this great run to come. So you're kind of backing the fixtures to bring form with it. He is, of course, cheaper than Nicholas Jackson, so I can get there in one move. And it does give me a bit of Crystal Palace coverage because, again, the fixtures are great and I do expect them to score goals. And Palace have looked in much better form recently too. Now, a couple of other strikers before we move on to other positions that I would be tempted by. Of course, Haaland is Haaland. He's obviously fantastic, but I just don't think I can get there without ripping up the rest of my side. I'm just not willing to do that. So if you've got him for the next couple of weeks, it's fantastic. Of course, Brentford and Ipswich, but I just can't get there I don't think I can even get there with my 3 free transfers, to be quite frank. And I think it would come to the detriment of the rest of my side if I was to try and do so. So after that, I've obviously already got Isak, who I would prioritise above all other forwards right now if you didn't already have him. And then Chris would be the next one. So the problem for me is bringing in Chris Wood ahead of game week 21. Obviously hasn't played game week 20 yet at time of recording, but Liverpool at home is not the best onboarding time, especially when Jackson himself has Bournemouth at home. So he's not an instant sell. And if I'm bringing in someone with a worse fixture and actually worse data per 90 as well, 0.41 is about 0.1 xg below Jackson as well, is it really worth making the transfer that week? Maybe the week after when they play Southampton, but I don't really think that that's a priority. So game week 22, perhaps that does make sense, but I'm not so sure in game week 21 it does. So I think I'd be much more likely to look at Raul if I wanted to save some money, or look at Mateta. The last player, actually, I quickly wanted to mention before moving on to the midfield, because I've got issues there too, is Liam Delap. Now, he's had a fantastic season for someone playing for a promoted side that is obviously going to struggle week on week. The data's not bad. 8 goals and 2 assists already in half a season is very decent. The problem, of course, is looking at the next few fixtures. It's not ideal, on paper at least, but Brighton and Man City both at home, both concede goals fairly regularly. Liverpool's obviously a stinker, but then Southampton at home as well. I would say 3 of the next 4 games, being at home as well, might not be the worst. So if you wanted an alternative to Jimenez, I'm not sure why you would, considering Jimenez has just bagged a brace. But Liam Delap might not be the worst decision you would make all season if you wanted to go against the grain. The fixtures, of course, on paper look bad, but I'm not so sure they're as awful as they look in terms of the FDR. So then, moving on to the midfield. Now, obviously, I think I'm pretty well set in the midfield, but there are 3 or 4 players in particular that I do really like the look of. So I'll focus on them first and see if there's a way to squeeze them into my starting 11 with a couple of free transfers for Game Week 21. The first of which that I really like the look of course, will come as no surprise. That's Anthony Gordon, who I'm very jealous of owners ahead of Game Week 21. I was also ahead of Game Week 20, by the way. I think he was maybe slightly unlucky not to get another goal, or at least something else in that Spurs game. Did get taken off early though, which is slightly interesting. But Wolves at home in Game Week 21, followed by Bournemouth and Southampton. It's a great little run of fixtures, and he will be very popular as a transfer in. The ownership's obviously growing, but he's still at a very affordable 7.5 million. The data across the season is also really strong, 0.6 XGI per 90. And considering this is a player that usually gets pretty decent, pretty strong minutes, not quite 90 minutes every game now, but around about 80 to 90 minutes on average, couple of early subs as I just mentioned, but not bad whatsoever. Anthony Gordon could definitely be a priority transfer in for me. After that, the next players that I'd like the look of, Morgan Rogers, as always, is going to be tempting. I'm not sure that the next 2 game weeks are necessarily the time for me to bring him back in, considering it's 2 away games against Everton, who can keep clean sheets and can keep it tight, and then Arsenal, who are, statistically at least, the best defence in the league in terms of their expected goals conceded. After that, though, Game Week 23, he will be a high priority for me. West Ham, Wolves, Ipswich, and at 5.5 million, great value for money. So that might be a transfer I look at making in just a couple of game weeks' time. After that, Bruno Fernandes is another player that will be interesting for a lot of managers, and maybe to a certain extent myself as well. Southampton at home in Game Week 21 is obviously low-hanging fruit. It's a great opportunity for someone like Bruno to get a big haul, and I would not be surprised at all if he does get one. But because I've already got Amad Diallo in my side at a much cheaper price, I'm very happy owning him for the Southampton game, and I don't think it's quite as good as having Bruno, but he is a lot cheaper, and I don't necessarily want to make transfers to bring in a player just for one game in particular. The run after that's fine. Brighton, Fulham, Crystal Palace, Spurs. It's a good run, but considering I'm pretty happy with at least 4 out of my 5 midfielders, and the 5th is Semenyo, so a bit cheaper, it wouldn't be easy for me to squeeze him in. And then if I did, it's 2 free transfers at least, because remember, I only have 0.4 in the bank. I'd have to downgrade elsewhere, and that would give me double United attack. And I'm not sure I'm that confident on United just yet to go double down on them, even with Southampton at home next up. After that, I will look at my team straight away ahead of Brighton in Game Week 22 and think, why have I got double United attack? So I'm not sure I need to go to Bruno, although I completely understand why some will. And I don't mind him as a replacement for someone like a Brian Mbeumo or a Luis Diaz if you did want to hop off away from them. I personally don't want to leave Brian Mbeumo on the side just yet. I'm very happy owning him with that City matchup. I really like Mbeumo in those counter-attacking matches, especially at home, and Man City are so susceptible to those fast breakaways this season. Mbeumo and Wissa in particular, especially because they'll probably be playing that 3-5-2 formation with both of them playing more centrally. I love them on the counter-attack against City, especially at home. So I think he's a great hold, and I don't want to look at making a free transfer, which again, I'm trying to implement that high bar on just to get a player for one admittedly very good fixture. Now, after that, there are a couple of other players that are of interest to me. Ismaila Sarr, 5.9 million is going to be tempting ahead of Leicester away from home. But not only that, it's a great run of fixtures for Palace. Leicester, West Ham, Brentford is a great triple. After that, it's not a bad run all the way through to game week 30, as I mentioned, a time where I might be looking at wildcarding. And Ismaila Sarr's minutes have been very consistently high over the last few game weeks. Since that haul against Brighton in game week 16, he's been a 90-minute man every single week, and the data has remained fairly strong, although it has now been 3 blanks in a row. So maybe one to monitor, but I think that's just variance. I think the data against Southampton in particular was very good. It wasn't bad at all against Chelsea. So I do think returns are still coming for Ismaila Sarr, and I don't want to just put him out of my thinking just because he's had a couple of or a few blanks in a row. All that being said, though, I do also have a second Palace on my mind, and that is Eberechi Eze, who has returned twice in a row now. The minutes are not quite as good as Sarr's, but also very good, 80 plus every single week, other than injuries, of course, but we'll let him off for that. We know the fixtures already are very good, and we know that he's on some set pieces too. I think for 6.6 million, he's definitely underpriced at this point, mainly because he did get a few price drops at the start of the season. So this might be an opportunity to get a cut price, very talented midfielder that I think is due to rise a few times over the next few game weeks. Whether or not he beats some of his competitors like Anthony Gordon, like Mbeumo, maybe even like a Bruno Fernandes as well, is up for debate, but he is cheaper than them. So if you need to save money and you like having a Palace attacker for this run of fixtures, which honestly I do like the look of, then maybe Eze is a nice route into that Crystal Palace attack. Now, outside of that, we're looking at my team and my transfer plans, of course. So am I willing to sacrifice any of my midfielders for the ones I've just mentioned? Well, the obvious one that I would be looking to get rid of is Semenyo, but outside of Rodgers, who I've explained I'm not really that fussed on bringing in this game week, I'm not sure that any of them are worth using 2 free transfers to get to in game week 21, when I'm already looking at starting Mbeumo, Palmer, Salah and Ahmad. That's a strong midfield 4. So if I'm getting rid of Semenyo, it needs to be for someone that objectively improves my starting midfield. And I don't think there's anyone out of anyone I've mentioned there that massively moves the needle. I think Gordon, maybe, possibly Bruno, but I've explained why I don't want to double up on the Man United attack, and that would mean downgrading heavily somewhere else. And Gordon, whilst I really do like owning him for game week 21, I'm not sure it's a massive upgrade on someone like Mbeumo, who is on penalties and who has got that really good matchup. Ahmad, possibly, but am I realistically going to waste a transfer to bench a player at home to Southampton? I don't think so, personally. Because I'm implementing that high bar, I think I'm most likely, right now as it stands anyway, to bench Semenyo and maybe just start with this midfield 4. So for the final section, let's take a look at the defence. And overall, I'm pretty happy with the defence makeup at the moment, although the more expensive assets in my backline are causing frustration. Trent, obviously only 1 week ago, he scored a 15-pointer, so I shouldn't get carried away by one poor performance, but against Man United, he did have a very off day, and more importantly than that, Connor Bradley was back on the bench and did get subbed on for him around about the 80th minute. So Trent's place in the starting lineup, I wouldn't say is necessarily massively up for debate, but his expected minutes might take a little bit of a nosedive now that Bradley is back and in contention. And you never know, if he keeps performing below par, then Bradley could come back in as an able deputy. So Trent himself might be a player that in a couple of game weeks' time makes sense to get rid of. But with the double game week looming for Liverpool, we think game week 25, no confirmation yet, it would be maybe a little bit knee-jerk to get rid of Trent ahead of that opportunity to have him in a double game week. But of course, I'll monitor the situation. He is a lot of money, and I can't really afford to hold Trent if he's going to be taken off early regularly, or maybe be a bench risk at some point, or if he just doesn't get me any points. So all of those factors need to be taken into consideration, but I'm not going to, I don't think anyway, get rid of a player who has just scored a 15-pointer, and we know how talented he is. We'll let him have one off performance, I think, in my mind anyway. And the fixtures for Liverpool are absolutely fine. Brentford, you'd expect goals, but Ipswich, Bournemouth, Wolves, it's a pretty decent run. And then we're also thinking that that double game week gets put in, most likely in game week 25, where it'd be Wolves and Everton. So do I want to get rid of Trent? I don't think just yet, but of course we'll kick the can down the road and see if he drops another stinker against Nottingham Forest, or maybe, who knows, he gets benched or even goes off to Real Madrid before the next game week even happens, which, you know, seems unlikely, but we have to maybe plan for all of these scenarios. Outside of that, very happy with Robinson, very happy with Hall, and Greaves has at least got his place back, so I'm not too concerned about any of those three. But Gabriel and Raya, obviously double Arsenal defence has not been performing to the level that I want or need it to for the amount of money I'm spending in the back line on these two. Now, until game week 20, where their data wasn't quite so good, but mainly because of that penalty they conceded, 0.79 for the penalty, of course, their XGC per 90 across the last few game weeks has been absolutely brilliant. So I think they've been maybe a tad unlucky not to keep more clean sheets than they have done, but they've got two tough fixtures over the next 2 game weeks for keeping clean sheets. And I'd say maybe 3 of the next 4 now, although they are all at home, are pretty tough. Spurs, Villa and Man City all at home. I don't think you're necessarily expecting clean sheets in those games, but if anyone was capable of doing so, it would still be the Arsenal defence. Now, if I was looking at downgrading a defender, so Gabriel per se, there are a few teams that you could look at bringing in from. Milenkovic or Aina at Nottingham Forest. Obviously, their defence has been phenomenal this season. But game week 21, Liverpool at home, it's not a great time to be buying them, I don't think, anyway. So I probably wouldn't be going for them this game week. After that, you've got Kirkez as well, who has been brilliant. Obviously, got the assist and the haul against Everton. But very similar, the fixtures just aren't really there now. Chelsea, Newcastle, both away, followed by Champions League bound Nottingham Forest at the moment and Liverpool. I don't think it's a time where you can be buying Kirkez. And after that, you're probably looking at someone like a Munoz, who has been quiet in the last couple of games, hasn't necessarily got the attacking returns, but the data has been fantastic. And the fixtures, as we've mentioned with other Crystal Palace assets at length in this video, are absolutely phenomenal all the way until game week 30. So this would be a little bit of a hit and hope that he does start returning on the underlying data. And of course, the defence, in terms of the data anyway, is nowhere near as good as Arsenal's. So if the fixtures were equal, you would expect Arsenal to be keeping quite a few more clean sheets than Palace would. But these fixtures are undoubtedly much better than Arsenal's are. So for a much cheaper price point, save a bit of money, and a bit more attacking threat than Gabriel, you could look at going for Munoz and hoping that that pays dividends over the next few game weeks. So if I wanted to force the issue, again, I could be looking at making a move there. Or in goal, I could look at potentially getting rid of Raya, maybe not overcommitting on the double Arsenal defence with Raya and Gabriel, and maybe getting in early on someone like Pickford, ahead of the double game week in maybe game week 25. Now, again, sadly, I don't think the fixtures are that great for clean sheets, so he might not be the most appealing keeper to be buying this week, but it'll be more of a long-term play, I think. And outside of that, you're looking at maybe Matt Sells, and sadly, again, like we said with Milenkovic or with Ola Aina, the on-ramp in Liverpool at home just isn't really there. It's not the best time to be buying him. So with that in mind, I think that in goal, I'm probably not going to be making a move this week. In my back line, maybe Trent or Gabriel could go. I think I'll probably give Trent another week just because he is a fantastic player. He's had an off night, of course, but until we know for sure that he is going to be a minutes risk, it would be wise, I think, to hold on to him, knowing that the double game week is coming. And Gabriel, again, he's still got such high goal threat from set pieces. The underlying data defensively for Arsenal on the whole is very, very strong. And Spurs, of course, aren't really massively at it right now either. So I think I'm probably going to hold on to them. And I'm pretty happy with the rest of my defence anyway as it stands. Looking at probably starting Gabriel, Trent and Lewis Hall, maybe benching Robinson away at West Ham. Although, again, that's a pretty strong bench defender to have on board. In the midfield, I've already discussed I'm likely to roll there, mainly because I'm happy with 4 out of the 5 anyway. Semenyo is probably a sell if you wanted to be more aggressive, but because I don't need to start him anyway, again, I can probably just hold him on my bench for the week. And then the most likely place that I'm tempted to make a transfer would probably be in my forward line. Now, Pedro and Isak are going nowhere right now. Good fixtures this week. Jackson is living on thin ice right now, and if I wanted to be a little bit more aggressive, but I don't think it would take that much to push me over the edge, going for someone like Mateta, who may not have the best data yet, but has fantastic fixtures and covers me on Crystal Palace over the next stretch of fixtures that you would expect people to go to Sarr, Eze or Munoz, then Mateta could be a nice alternative there and a bit of a differential. When Jackson isn't really performing, for a little bit cheaper, that might not be a bad route to take. I also do quite like Raul, but I think the problem with Raul for me is you never know when the next benching is coming, and although he will be popular because of the brace, he won't get 2 penalties every single week either. So maybe I just want to manage my expectations on that a little bit, and it would also give me 2 sub 6 million forwards, which might, in the long term, leave me a little bit unbalanced and looking to shift money around to re-upgrade one of them in a few game weeks' time. So with that in mind, I think one free transfer is definitely on the cards, that being Jackson to someone like a Mateta, but I'm not ruling out being more aggressive and trying to find a way of squeezing in someone like an Anthony Gordon or a Munoz in my back line. As we reach the end of today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video, of course. And if there are any players that I haven't discussed or any questions that you have, do feel free to leave a comment below and we can go through it through the week before we hit the Game Week 21 deadline.